picture this. It's 1776. Britain is basically the biggest kid on the playground. They've got the largest empire in the world, colonies scattered across the globe, the most powerful navy on Earth, and enough confidence to think nobody could ever challenge them. Then, 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic, there's a bunch of farmers, shopkeepers, blacksmiths, and tavern owners. People just trying to make a living. They start asking a question that Britain definitely did not want them asking. Why are you making all of our decisions from an ocean away? And honestly, that is where the American Revolution really began. Not with muskets or explosions, not with George Washington dramatically crossing the Delaware like it's the climax of an action movie. It starts in taverns, around dinner tables, in print shops, in crowded meeting halls where ordinary people are slowly realizing something doesn't feel right anymore. Because this wasn't one bad day that suddenly made everyone want to rebel. This had been building for years. More taxes, more rules, more reminders that Britain was still calling the shots. Little by little, the colonies stopped feeling like partners in the empire and started feeling more like property. And once enough people start asking, wait, is this actually fair? It's really hard to put that genie back in the bottle. Welcome back to Pretty Strange, the podcast where we deep dive into history, mystery, and curious conspiracies. I'm your host, Taylor, and today we're celebrating America's 250th birthday by talking about one of the biggest, well, that escalated quickly, moments in history, the American Revolution. Or in simpler terms, how a bunch of colonists went from complaining about taxes to taking on the biggest empire in the world, and eventually creating the country that gave us Costco, Cool Ranch Doritos, and a 64-ounce soda for $1. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably haven't thought about the American Revolution since high school. You memorized enough dates to pass the test, immediately forgot them all, and filed that entire topic under stuff I'll never use again. And honestly, I get it. History classes have this incredible talent for taking stories that involve spies, riots, political drama, and betrayal and literal war, and making them feel like you're watching paint dry. But here's the thing. History is actually kind of messy. It's full of people making terrible decisions, incredibly brave decisions, people completely misunderstanding each other, and occasionally throwing hundreds of crates of tea into a harbor because they're making a point. And I think that's way more interesting than the version most of us learned in school. So every now and then here on Pretty Strange, I want to hit pause on the ghosts, the cryptids, and the conspiracy theories and dive into some real history. Not the version that sounds like a textbook, but the version where we actually understand why people did what they did. Because once you understand the why, everything else suddenly starts making a whole lot more sense. So before we get into the battles, the George Washington, and the powdered wigs of it all, we need to answer one very important question. Who exactly were these colonists, and what made them so angry that they were willing to risk absolutely everything? So who were these people exactly? Because when we hear the word colonists, it's easy to picture a giant group of people marching in the same direction with American flags waving behind them. Except none of that existed yet. There were about 2.5 million people living across the 13 colonies that stretched along the East Coast. They spoke English, followed British laws, and they paid taxes to Britain. For the most part, they considered themselves British, which is kind of funny when you think about it because most of them had never actually even been to Britain. Imagine someone saying, "Oh yeah, I'm British," and then you ask, "Oh cool, like where about, where from?" And they say, "Oh, I've never been there." That's how the colonies were. They weren't Americans yet. Nobody was celebrating 4th of July. Nobody was wearing stars and stripes. Nobody had an eagle tattoo or a rude political bumper sticker. They were just British subjects living on the other side of the Atlantic, just trying to build homes, raise families, run businesses, and survive. And honestly, for a long time, that arrangement worked pretty well. Until it didn't. Now, let's talk about Britain for a second, because I don't want to paint them as some cartoon villain twirling a mustache while evil music plays in the background. That's not really what's happening here. Britain was running an enormous empire, and empires are expensive. At the center of it all was King George III, Parliament, and the British military, all trying to keep control of colonies that were becoming bigger, wealthier, and honestly a lot harder to manage from 3,000 miles away. Think about trying to run a business where your employees are on another continent and every email takes 6 weeks to arrive. That's basically what they were dealing with. And here's something that surprised me when I was researching this episode. Most colonists didn't actually hate the king at first. History kind of makes it seem like everyone immediately blamed the king for everything, but in the beginning, a lot of the frustration was just aimed at Parliament. Their thinking was basically, the king probably doesn't even know what's going on over here. It's Parliament making all these decisions. But spoiler alert, that opinion changes. Now, you've probably heard the names George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, John Adams, and Sam Adams. Those are the history book celebrities. They're the people who helped take all of this growing frustration and turn it into something organized, something political and revolutionary. But here's what I think gets left out of a lot of history classes. Not everyone wanted independence. No, seriously. We kind of tell the story of the revolution like every colonist stood up at the same time and yelled, "Yeah, let's do this." That is not what happened. Historians estimate that roughly a third of the colonists remained loyal to Britain. These people were called loyalists. Duh. And they believed staying part of the British Empire was the safer, smarter choice. Another third supported independence. And the rest, they were somewhere in the middle, still trying to figure out whose side they were on. Could you imagine that? Your next door neighbor supports the revolution, your cousin thinks it's a terrible idea, your brother wants to stay loyal to Britain, and you're just sitting there thinking like, can we just chill for 5 minutes, please? Families were divided, friendships ended, communities split right down the middle. This wasn't simply colonists versus Britain. In a lot of ways, it was neighbor versus neighbor, brother versus brother, friend versus friend, and honestly, I think that's part of what makes the American Revolution feel so human. Ugh, could you imagine if there was social media at this time? Barf. Britain spewing hate about the colonists sharing hate memes about Parliament, families arguing on Facebook over where they got their tea from. What a mess. Ugh. When we look back now, it's easy to think everyone just knew how the story was going to end. Of course, America wins. Of course, independence happens. But they didn't know that. They were making decisions without knowing if they were choosing the winning side or signing their own death warrants. That's a terrifying place to be. And that's exactly why the story is so much more interesting than the version most of us learned in school. So, what actually pushed everyone over the edge? Because, let's be honest, most of us learned some version of this in school that went like this. Taxes happened, people got mad, tea went swimming, and boom, America. It's a little more complicated than that. To understand why the colonists were so angry, we actually have to rewind a few years. Before there was an American Revolution, there was another war. It was called the 7 Years' War, and it wasn't just fought in one place. This was basically the first true global war. Fighting broke out across Europe, North America, the Caribbean, India, pretty much everywhere Britain and France had something to lose. Britain ended up winning. Huge victory. More land, more power, more influence over the world, and one absolutely massive credit card bill. Wars are expensive. Like really expensive. Britain had spent a fortune defeating France, and now someone had to help pay for it. Can you guess who got volunteered? Yep, the colonies. Now, from Britain's perspective, this actually made a lot of sense. Their argument was basically, we just spent all this money protecting you during the war, so it's only fair that you help cover the cost. The colonists looked at that argument and said, yeah, hard pass. That's where things start to get messy. The first major issue was something called the Stamp Act. Now, the name doesn't exactly scream excitement, but if you were alive in 1765, you definitely notice it. The government suddenly started taxing all kinds of everyday paper products. Buying a newspaper? Tax. Signing a legal document? Tax. Playing cards with your friends? Believe it or not, also taxed. And individually, none of these taxes were huge, but that's almost what made them more annoying. It felt like Britain had found a way to stick its hand into every little part of your daily life. The people were furious. They protested. They boycotted British goods. Some tax collectors were even threatened or chased out of town. This wasn't just people grumbling anymore, people were organizing. Then Britain doubled down. Next came the Townshend Acts. These added taxes on imported goods like glass, paper, paint, lead, and of course, tea. Now, here's the part that's really important. The taxes themselves weren't actually the biggest issue, it was who was creating them. So remember that. The colonists had no representatives in Parliament. None. Zero. Like, imagine getting a bill in the mail from a city you've never lived in, written by politicians you didn't vote for, telling you what you owe. You'd probably have a few questions. That's where one of the most famous phrases in history came from. No taxation without representation. I know, right? We've heard it a million times, but do we remember where it came from? No, we just know, oh yeah, I heard that in school. Honestly, it's a pretty catchy slogan. It wasn't just about money, it was about having a voice. The colonists weren't saying we never want to pay taxes. They were just saying, maybe let us have a seat at the table before you start making decisions for us. Then came the Tea Act. This one gets confused with the earlier taxes all the time. The Tea Act wasn't just another random tea tax. It actually gave the British East India Tea Company a huge advantage by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies. Britain thought they were solving a financial problem. The colonists saw it a completely different way. To them, it felt like Britain was saying, we're going to tell you what to buy, who to buy it from, and you're just going to have to accept it. By this point, people weren't really upset about tea anymore. Tea just had become the symbol. Every shipment arriving in the harbor felt like Britain saying, we're still in charge. And eventually, someone decided to make a statement. A really dramatic statement. One night in December of 1773, a group of colonists climbed aboard British ships in Boston Harbor. To hide their identities, they disguised themselves as Mohawk men. Then they started throwing tea overboard. Not one crate, not 10, hundreds of them. Can you imagine looking out your window that night, just hearing splash after splash while thousands of pounds of tea disappear into the harbor? Today, people estimate that the destroyed tea would be worth well over $1 million. So imagine someone dumping over $1 million worth of Amazon packages right into the ocean on purpose, while making direct eye contact with Bezos. That's basically the energy. Britain was less than amused. In fact, they responded by punishing Boston with a series of laws the colonists called the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was shut down, self-government was restricted, British control tightened even further. And instead of calming everyone down, it had the exact opposite effect. Because by now, this wasn't just about taxes. It wasn't even about the tea. It had become a fight over who got to make the rules. Okay, let's address what's probably the biggest question people have when they hear this story. Why didn't they just pay the taxes? Seriously. If you've ever sat through a history class, you probably had that thought. Guys, just pay the tax, problem solved. Except that was never really the problem. Were the taxes annoying? Absolutely. Did people complain about them? Constantly. But it's not like every colonist was suddenly bankrupt because they had to pay extra for paper or tea. The amount of money wasn't really what pushed everyone over the edge. It was the principle behind it. Because once Parliament proved it could tax the colonies without asking, what was stopping them from doing more? If they could decide your taxes, could they decide your laws, your property, your rights? Where did it stop? That uncertainty scared people. Imagine if your boss walked into work one day and said, "Good news! We've decided we're cutting your paycheck by 10%. And you say, "Wait, who voted on that?" And they say, "Oh, nobody, we just decided." You'd probably be updating your resume before lunch. That's kind of how the colonists felt. The taxes weren't the issue. The real issue was control. And while all of this was happening, something else was quietly changing. The colonists themselves. Remember, these people had been living in North America for generations. They built towns, started businesses, created local governments, developed their own traditions. Life in Boston looked completely different from life in London. Life in Virginia looked very different from life in England. And little by little, they stopped thinking of themselves as people temporarily living overseas and started wondering if they were becoming something new entirely. Not quite British anymore, but not American yet either. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened gradually. And then there was another piece of the puzzle, the Enlightenment. Now, I know that sounds like one of those terms your history teacher throws out and everyone immediately zones out, but please stay with me because this part actually matters. The Enlightenment was basically a period where philosophers started asking some really dangerous questions. Questions like, where does the government get its power? Who should be in charge? Do kings actually have the right to rule just because they're born into it? One of the biggest names you'll hear around the Enlightenment is John Locke. And Locke had an idea that was pretty revolutionary, no pun intended. He argued that governments only exist because people agree to let them exist. Listen to that again. Not because the king says so, not because God picked somebody, but because the people allow it. And if a government stops protecting the rights of its citizens, the people have the right to change it or replace it entirely. Today, that idea doesn't sound that shocking. We vote, we highly criticize politicians, we expect governments to answer to people, but in the 1700s, that was an absolutely wild thing to say. It challenged the entire way Europe had operated for centuries, and suddenly, the colonists had something they didn't have before: a philosophy. A way to explain why resisting Britain wasn't just emotional, it was justified. So, no, they weren't refusing to pay taxes because they were being stubborn or because they were being cheap. They were asking a much bigger question. If a government can take away one right without your permission, what stops it from taking away the next one? And once enough people started asking that question, the conversation wasn't really about taxes anymore. It was about freedom. And that's a conversation that's a whole lot harder to shut down. Let's talk about where all of this actually happened. Because if you're picturing one giant battlefield where everyone showed up, fought the revolution, packed up, and went home, that's not how this worked. The revolution played out all along the East Coast, and each place tells a different part of the story. So buckle up, we're going on a road trip. The first stop, Boston, 1765. If the American Revolution had a hometown, it'd be Boston. This city was basically the center of all the drama. Since the colonists were mad about the taxes and felt like Britain was looming over them waiting to take more control, there were protests, riots, British soldiers everywhere, political speeches, and arguments spilling into the streets. If something controversial was happening in the colonies, there was a pretty good chance Boston was involved somehow. In 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. A crowd confronts British soldiers. Someone throws a snowball, apparently. Then more objects are thrown, the soldiers panic, shots are fired, and 5 colonists are killed. Historians still debate exactly what happened, but politically the damage is done. The Patriots used the event to convince thousands more colonists that Britain isn't protecting them, it's threatening them. 3 years later, Boston is back in the spotlight with the Boston Tea Party. Boston became the city where Britain and the colonies stopped just yelling at each other and started daring each other to make the first move. Next stop, Lexington and Concord. You've probably heard the phrase, the shot heard round the world. That's referring to the first battles of the American Revolution. In April of 1775, British troops marched toward Concord because they'd gotten word that the colonists were storing weapons there. Their mission? Take the weapons. Prevent a rebellion before it could really even begin. Simple enough, except someone leaked the plan. Thanks to writers like Paul Revere spreading the word, colonial militia were waiting. The British arrived expecting to collect supplies, but instead, they found armed resistance. And then, someone fired a shot. To this day, nobody knows for certain who pulled the trigger first, but honestly, by that point, it almost didn't matter. Once the first shot rang out, there was no going back. The argument had officially become war. Next, we head to Philadelphia. Now, Philadelphia wasn't famous because of battles. It was famous because of ideas. This is where representatives of the colonies gathered to ask the biggest questions imaginable. Are we actually doing this? This is where the Declaration of Independence was debated, argued over, edited, and finally signed. With one document, the colonies stopped asking Britain to fix the relationship and officially said, "We're done."
You're done.
Next up, New York. The British captured the city early on and turned it into their headquarters. This city became one of the biggest military battlegrounds of the entire war, and where it became painfully obvious that beating Britain was going to be a lot harder than anyone imagined. The Battle of Saratoga, 1777. This doesn't always get as much attention as it deserves, but this battle is major. British General John Burgoyne had a plan to split the colonies in half. Instead, his army got surrounded and eventually surrendered. This victory does something incredibly important. It convinces France that the Americans might actually pull this off. France, aka Britain's biggest rival. They basically looked at the colonies and went, "Oh, you're fighting Britain? Say less." They weren't sitting around thinking, "Yo, these colonists have some really compelling political arguments." Could they have been inspired by the revolutionary ideals? A little, yeah. Were they absolutely thrilled with the opportunity to make Britain's life as difficult as possible? Hell yeah. France was able to provide ships, soldiers, money, and weapons, and now all of a sudden, Britain had an international problem. Finally, we make our way to Yorktown, Virginia. 1781, the Siege of Yorktown. This is the payoff. British General Charles Cornwallis moves his army to Yorktown, Virginia, expecting help from the British Navy. That help never arrives. American troops surrounded him on land, French ships block him by sea, and he's trapped. After weeks of fighting, Cornwallis surrenders. Major fighting in the Revolution is officially over. The Treaty of Paris is signed in 1783. This is where everything finally becomes official. Britain recognizes the United States as an independent nation, the borders are established, the Revolutionary War is over, and America officially exists. Now, you might be wondering, if America became independent in 1783, why do we celebrate July 4th, 1776? Well, simple. Because July 4th, 1776 celebrates the moment America declared its independence. 1783 is just Britain finally admitting it. Using the date where the Declaration was signed makes total sense because we were never really waiting around for permission. When you zoom out and look at the timeline, the revolution isn't one single event, it's like a fuse. One spark lit the path until eventually the whole thing exploded. Here's a side note where the story gets pretty strange. If you've ever consumed any media about the American Revolution, you probably think George Washington spent the entire war riding around on a horse looking heroic while winning every battle. But that's not what happened. In fact, Washington lost a lot. And I don't mean he had like one bad day. I mean there were multiple points during the war where it genuinely looked like the revolution might just fail. His army was constantly running out of supplies. Soldiers deserted, many weren't even getting paid, some didn't even have proper shoes. Imagine trying to fight one of the most powerful militaries in the world while half of your army is hungry and the other half is wondering if they should just pack it up and go home. Washington wasn't some undefeated military genius. He survived, he adapted, he learned from mistakes, and maybe most importantly, he refused to quit. Honestly, I think that's way more impressive than pretending he never struggled in the first place. But that's only the first myth. Also, I just want to note, because I learned this on Facebook today, his teeth weren't actually made of wood. Okay, like everybody thinks that George Washington had wooden teeth. He didn't. What he actually had was like a pair of fancy pants, like dentures made out of ivory that had cracked and been stained with wine. But then also they were teeth of slaves. Like slaves were either coerced or volunteered to give up their teeth for money. And he had slave teeth. So, side note, think that's really kind of interesting. Learned that on Facebook today. So, anyway. Okay, that's the first myth. Here's another one. We tend to picture the revolution as Americans versus Britain. Nice, simple, easy to understand. Except, it wasn't. Remember those loyalists we talked about earlier? They didn't disappear once the fighting started. They were still there. Living next door, working in the same towns, going to the same churches, sometimes even living in the same house. Families were torn apart over this war. Brothers ended up on opposite sides. Neighbors stopped trusting each other, friendships ended. People were risking their lives over these disagreements. That's what makes civil conflict so unsettling. The enemy isn't always someone you've never met. Sometimes it's someone you've known your entire life. And here's something I don't think we talk about enough. The sheer audacity of what some of these people are doing. Seriously, try to put yourself in their shoes. You're not protesting anymore. You're not writing strongly worded letters. You're signing your name to a document that openly declares your independence from the most powerful empire on earth. If Britain wins, you're not getting grounded. You're probably getting hanged. It was a huge risk. Every single person who signed the Declaration of Independence knew exactly what could happen if this failed. They weren't gambling with money. They were gambling with their lives, their families, everything they'd built. Looking back, it's easy for us to think, well, obviously America was going to win, but they had no idea. For all they knew, they were betting on the losing side of history. And that's what I find so fascinating. The American Revolution wasn't inevitable. It wasn't neat, and it wasn't perfectly coordinated to some master plan. It was a series of imperfect people making impossible decisions with incomplete information. A general who lost more battles than most people even realized, trying to hold together an exhausted army. Neighbors choosing opposite sides of the same conflict. France jumping into the war for reasons that had more to do with hurting Britain than helping America. And a handful of people willing to risk everything for an idea they hoped would work. When you look at it that way, the revolution feels less like a guaranteed victory and more like one incredibly risky gamble that somehow paid off. When you step back and really look at the American Revolution, it stops feeling like a neat little story we learned in school, and it gets a lot more real. Independence was not inevitable. In 1776, a handful of colonies decided to challenge the most powerful empire on earth with no guarantee they'd win, and plenty of reasons to believe they'd lose. If they failed, there was no reset button, no awkward, "our bad," and everyone moves on. They were risking their homes, their fortunes, and in many cases, their lives. And that's what makes the revolution so fascinating. Strip away the fireworks and the patriotic music, and what you're left with is something much more human. Ordinary people arguing over impossible decisions, taking enormous risks, and trying to build something that had never really existed before. Whether you see it as a fight for liberty, a political breaking point, or the messiest breakup in history worthy of an Olivia Rodrigo anthem, one thing is undeniable. It changed history. Not because success was guaranteed, but because enough people were willing to gamble that it was possible. Thanks for coming along for the ride through the American Revolution on this special 4th of July episode of Pretty Strange. Happy 250th, America! If you made it this far, I'm assuming you know more about the American Revolution now than you did this morning, which means you're officially not allowed to say you don't like history anymore. I'm off to live the American dream. Gonna go watch some loud-ass fireworks, drink a bucket-sized Diet Coke, and eat something fried dipped in an obscene amount of ranch. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to like, follow, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into history, mystery, and everything just a little bit strange. Bye!